Hi there, welcome back to the Complicated Kids podcast. I'm your host, Gabriele Nicolet. I am a toddler whisperer, a speech therapist, and a parent coach. And today I am very excited to be joined by Dr. Diane Hennacy Powell. Diane, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a real pleasure to have you. People will note the name, and we'll get into it, I'm sure, from the recent podcast, the telepathy tapes. And so we're going to talk about that. But before I do that, tell the good people a little bit about yourself and your work in the field here.
Okay, well, first of all, I trained in neuropsychiatry at Johns Hopkins, and I went over to England in 1987 to spend 6 months with Sir Michael Rudder, who was the world's expert on autism and developmental disorders. And so I did 6 months of child psychiatry over there, and that's when I met my first autistic child. And then I came back to the US, and autism was still pretty rare back then. But I never lost my interest in it. And it was when Donna Williamson's book came out, Nobody Nowhere, that I read this account, firsthand account for the first time from an autistic individual who had written a diary basically um, trying to figure out who she was and felt like she was nobody nowhere. And the
Mm.
psychiatrist read it and told her she was autistic. And when I heard that interview with her, I thought, oh, this is so fascinating. For once now, we have the ability to understand what the world is like with these children, and because laptops became available, and so it created this opportunity to communicate with people who previously didn't couldn't engage in normal conversations about themselves.
And this is because, for people who are listening who don't know, some autistic individuals are also have bodies that do not obey their commands. And so,
But
right, there are some people who are autistic who are perfectly verbal and all the way in their bodies and have control. And there are some people who are autistic who really don't. And so their speech is either not they don't speak, they're incapable of physical speech, or they speech is very, very difficult for them and it's unreliable. Is there anything you want to add there before we kind of move on?
Well, one of the things that was interesting about Donna Williamson is that she could speak,
Mm.
but the way that her brain was wired was such that she couldn't engage in conversation in a direct way. So I remember when I heard her in the interview have to type out her answer to a question. So the interviewer would ask her something, and then she'd type out the answer and she'd read it. And the
Huh.
interviewer made note of the fact that it was like there was like some little, gap there in her own way of having an inner dialogue
Mm. She had to
that, that
externalize. She had to
that she had to
externalize before.
externalize it, then read it, and then she could answer the question. And I thought, wow, okay. As a neuropsychiatrist who's really been interested in, how the brain works, how it relates to consciousness, how are we all wired, why do we experience reality differently? That was just like, oh wow, this is such an opportunity to really understand these individuals.
This is going to go so deep so quickly. I have several thoughts at the same time. One is there is this phenomenon, this, in my experience, this is common among the children I work with, young children. So in the children I work with, it is often true that some of what they need to learn appears to come from the outside in. In other words, they have an internal intention, they would like to do something, but they're not sure how. So that's the gap you were just talking about. And then what they need is an external person or system or tool to help them integrate that skill. And then often, in my experience, they can then learn that skill, internalize it, but it's not ever really automatic. This is I'm just putting it together for the first time talking to you here. And so social skills are like that. And I hate that term, but that's the term people understand. But there are these, like, what we consider to be human processes that are not automatic in autism sometimes.
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, we take a lot of these things for granted that we think that it's almost reflexive, and it's not for these individuals. And so there are these workarounds
Yeah.
that they find. And this is not uncommon for people that have different brain wiring. I mean, we know that people who are blind, for example, can learn how to navigate through something called echolocation, where they'll emit sounds, and then they use like a sonar. They use the sound wave that bounces back to help them to know where objects are in space, and their visual cortex gets recruited to engage in this sort of navigational mapping, because if they're blind from birth on or early on, then while the brain is still plastic, then it can we're not going to let that go to waste. The visual cortex is too high of a percentage of the brain, and it's such an incredible tool that it's not going to go to waste. And so you have these people who are blind, who using echolocation can do things like climb mountains and and ski.
Right. And
So
see, in fact, right? Like
yes,
this is the
yeah,
other piece of it.
yeah, and so I think of these non-speaking autistic individuals as being kind of in a similar category, that something about their brain wiring is different early on enough, while the brain is still actively, being pruned, or which is also sculpting it into the wiring that's then going to enable them to function.
Yeah. I went to speech pathology school, graduate school in the late 90s. I finished in 2001, and at that time it was a dirty word, facilitated communication. Spelling didn't even exist. The rapid prompting method did not exist. And to this day, and I'm just going to go here right now, to this day, the National Association of Speech Language Pathologists, ASHA, is very has a very hard line on anything, any form of communication that requires assistance from another person. I'm unclear actually about their stance on spellers, spelling to communicate. In other words, if you have a non-speaking autistic person who cannot access speech easily, you give them an augmentative device. They type, or they have a device with pictures that speaks, and they can use it in air quotes independently. That seems to be okay. And again, okay in air quotes. And 2 summers ago, I went to visit a friend of mine who is a 13-year-old non-speaking person. And I was astounded, because I was coming from this school of this was before telepathy tapes. I was coming from this school of thou shalt not, aid your non-speaker. And their mom had to redirect their attention to the laptop that they were holding, because their body was, and if you're watching this on YouTube, you can see I'm looking all over the place, kind of attention was interrupted. Motor skills were very hard to corral. So I'm watching this. I spent a couple hours there. And my friend, now my friend, I asked them a question at one point. I said, would it be all right for me to ask your mom some things about when you were a child? I asked a yes or no question on purpose, okay? Because I thought it's so effortful to type. They'll either press yes, a Y, or an N for no, right? And we had been communicating before. They typed, "You are considerate of my needs."
Mm-hmm.
Which, number one, is not a response that anybody could have thought of, least of all her mother. Number two, is a very autistic response. And it's very long and complex to formulate motorically. And so I say that as anecdata, really, but that's my lived experience of watching this, coming from this very skeptical place of oh, I don't know what she's going to say. I don't know what they're going to say. And really having a moment with myself and with this 13-year-old. And so this is not a surprise to you, but do you want to sort of talk about the kids that you have worked with and studied?
Well, what I'd like to do is I'd like to make a comment about because you asked me about spelling, and
Mm,
I think one of the things that's very unfortunate is that spelling to communicate gets lumped in to the same category as FC. And there's a big difference between whether or not someone is using a letterboard, let's say, and a pencil or their finger to point to letters on the letterboard, and someone who needs to have their wrist held
mm,
while they're doing the pointing. And so I can see why people get confused by seeing, this parent who's so actively involved in the communication process, why they have issues with it. It doesn't mean that the criticism is correct in that I really think that many of those children are really being, they're just being supported,
mm,
uh, and that's all it really is. But that's hard to convince people. But when you look at RPM or spelling to communicate, and you see that they're not being touched, and you see them with deliberation point at the letterboard, and you see the facial expressions of them, and you see that their facial expressions really speak to a communication occurring. There's a level of like sitting back and satisfaction when they finish their, you just see all of these, body language clues and facial, expression clues that something went on there.
mm,
And so I think that it's a mistake to think that the communication isn't happening, and number one. And I think that there's some simple things that we can do to try to prove spelling. And for example, one of them would be to do things like compare the language that the facilitator uses and the kinds of statements like you just made, thank you for being considerate or my needs. Compare the language because people's choices of words
mm.
are very individualized. And so that's one way we can do it. And the other way we can do it is by doing some neuroimaging studies to see, which areas of their brain are not functioning in the usual way that it could be interfering with their ability to speak. And some of these children have what we call a Broca's aphasia, which is an expressive aphasia. They still understand language. If this had been an elderly person who had had a stroke in that region of the brain, we would have given them the benefit of the doubt that they still understood language. But with these children, we don't give them the benefit of the doubt on the whole. I mean, a lot. So that's one thing. But some of these children, they have proprioceptive issues. They don't really know where their body is in space. And so we really need to assess them to figure out why it is that they aren't speaking and then assist them appropriately.
Do you do you think this is, kind of a pie in the sky question, but to your point about if an adult has a stroke, we do neuroimaging and we understand the nature of their brain. I won't even say brain damage, their brain function. And then we have maybe we kind of understand what the path to rehabilitation is. If we're talking about autistic children, we've got a path toward habilitation, number one, which is, by the way, why insurance won't cover it. It's a different conversation. But are we ever going to get to a point where we see symptoms that we think are neurological and a brain scan, some kind of neuroimaging is going to be useful? Are we getting there?
I'm trying to drive us there.
Yay! Yeah, okay. Okay. And do you think that we will get to a place where that is like one of the diagnostic tools that people use?
I hope so. I mean, and let me clarify, when I'm talking about brain imaging, I realize that some of the brain imaging that people are familiar with is really not it's just not feasible to do with some of these children. So, for example, if you're talking about a functional MRI, okay, which is something that measures blood flow, that requires the child to be still in an MRI machine, which makes a lot of people claustrophobic. And it's very challenging for these children to stay still.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, many of these children have seizure disorders, and you're exposing them to large magnetic fields. So the way around that is by there's this, and this is not used as a clinical tool very often, but there's something called QEEGs. And what that is it's measuring the electrical potential at the surface of the skull, but also combining that with a computerized software that will analyze the frequency of the waves and analyze the signal, break it down using Fourier analysis to where is it coming from.
Okay.
And so you can compare that against normative data, and you can get a lot of similar sort of functional assessments to the fMRI, but it's something that you can do in a much more low-key setting. If the person moves around a lot, you can basically remove that artifact, look for the sections of the recording when they were still, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, so QEEG is a more functional way to measure brain activity in somebody who has to move and who doesn't want to be exposed to a lot of magnetic stimulation. Yeah, okay. And here's my rant. There are many. We diagnose autism based on a set of behaviors, the presence or absence or prevalence, like extent of behaviors. And when kids get older, then we ask them about their internal experience, and then we can make some diagnosis from that. Are we even sure that we're looking at the same thing all the time?
We're definitely not looking at the same thing, and that's one of my big beefs as well. It so the problem is that autism was made a psychiatric diagnosis, okay? And when you make something a psychiatric diagnosis, then not only does it pathologize something in a way that makes it sort of like a psychological pathology, um, it also makes it a diagnosis that's based on a syndrome and not a disease causation. So what I mean by that is you have a syndrome is a cluster of behaviors and cognitions and emotions. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have that cluster of, well, something's abnormal about this child's language development, which that's a huge broad category, because as I said earlier, there's different types of language disorders. There's, comprehension and expression are totally different. And
Yep.
so you have something different about their language development, then you have something different about their socialization. But if you think about it, how social are you going to be if your language is not the same language of other people, if you don't express yourself in the same way, or if conversational language is challenging for you?
Mm-hmm.
And then the third thing is engaging in repetitive behaviors. Well, there's a lot of reasons why someone might engage in repetitive behaviors. One reason is that somebody's anxious.
Yeah.
And, another reason is, as some of these children in the podcast have said, it's that they can't feel their body, and by moving, it helps them to maintain some kind of body awareness.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and for some of them, it's just that those repetitive behaviors are soothing for them because they have more of a need to control something when there's so little that they have control over. And so I think the problem is there's a lot of reasons why you could have each one of these things, and to just say, oh, they're all the same thing, just lump them all together is really problematic. But one of the reasons why it's set up that way is not only because it falls under the category of a psychiatric diagnosis, but another reason why is that the vast majority of these children are being diagnosed by pediatricians. And those pediatricians don't have my specialized expertise. I trained in psychiatry and neurology and child psychiatry. And I specifically also looked into autism. And so for most pediatricians, they just see a child that sort of they can tick off the boxes and they can just say it's a autistic spectrum disorder. And then, they just say, okay, and this is the treatment that's available, ABA, and that's it.
And it's interesting, right? Because at one level, we want to democratize identification so that we can also democratize treatment, right? We want kids, and I hate the word treatment too, but so that we can give support. At the same time, I hear what you're saying, which is like there are people who know just enough to be dangerous, and maybe I'm one of them, who are shaping children's destinies in maybe a way that they shouldn't be. And so it then falls on the parents to engage in a lot of discernment, in a lot of information gathering. One of the things that continues to be, prescribed as autism treatment is ABA. My friend who I described earlier, my non-speaking friend, had some choice words to say about ABA, and they were not good.
Mhm.
Nor was their education particularly good because she couldn't speak. They were treated as if they were not there, stupid, not listening, not paying attention. And I want to actually right now, for anybody who's listening who works with somebody who works with a child or knows a child or loves a child who appears to not pay attention. This is like one of the big things that I see. Their bodies don't look like they're paying attention, and they probably are. Probably what they're doing with their bodies is allowing them to pay attention. I don't know if you've seen that in your work.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, I can relate to it to some extent because I was a hair twirler in school, and so people who do NLP say, "Oh, you're really kinesthetic," and I think better if I'm moving a little bit.
Mhm.
And and it so and I ran into the same thing with my daughter when she was in school. She would twirl her hair and she'd get in trouble. They'd say, "Oh, you're not paying attention." And I explained to them, I said, "No, this helps her to pay attention."
Mhm. Mhm. And I
And a
think,
lot of it is that they're bored.
well, then there's
It's hard to
that.
pay attention when you're bored.
So this is funny because I was with a kid today who actually has, and the way I'm starting to think about these kids is more and more of them, and I want to ask you why in a second, have what I call highly sensitive nervous systems. They have a lot of nervous system dysregulation, which means that parts of their brains are at war with each other because there's the learning part that is academically advanced in some cases. We didn't even talk about savant skills, but we'll hold off for just a second, but really dialed in. And then there's the emotional part of the brain that's also dialed in, feeling things very deeply. And then there's whatever integrative part of what's going on, which really cannot hang. That nervous system is constantly dysregulating. And these kids are in a state of stress chronically. They're in chronic stress, which has detrimental effects. So the question I want to ask you is, why are there more of these kids now than ever? And do you see the same? What's your take on what I just said?
Um, well, um, yeah, first of all, these children are highly sensitive. They have uh, they have more sensitive sense of smell,
Mm,
oftentimes more sensitive sense of hearing. A lot of them have perfect pitch. But some of them can hear somebody from down the block. Um, and they also are very sensitive to light.
Mhm.
And so if you think about it as just that they all of their senses are on a higher alert, so that it's just imagine yourself having all of your senses amplified. Okay. Then you add on top of that emotionally they're contrary to what people think about them. They're sensitive to other people's feelings. They pick up on what other people are feeling, and they don't they're kind of porous. They take it in like a sponge.
Mhm.
So they need a really calm environment around them. And yet it's hard to have a calm environment when you're also hearing things louder than other people hear them. And the lights are brighter, et cetera, et cetera. So there's all of these things that are distracting.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Um, it's really for anybody who's ever had a migraine or stomach upset or chronic pain. That's I sometimes tell parents, like, imagine yourself, you haven't had your coffee yet, you're constipated, you haven't eaten, and now someone is asking you to take a math test.
Exactly. And a lot of these children do have migraines. A lot of
Mm,
these children are in pain.
mhm. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so we've kind of described the landscape here. Your work is really interesting. You ask questions that people get upset about. And before we go into that for a second, I just want to say it's not either of our intentions here to convert anybody or to convince anybody of anything. Keep listening if you want to. And if it's not resonating, bye bye. But you feel very strongly about asking questions that interest you and looking for some answers. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to ask questions. I mean, and so in trying to understand these children, what their world is like, um, and trying to understand savant skills, and why is it that autistic children have a much higher incident of these, what Daryl Trefford called islands of genius, where they may not be able to do simple arithmetic, but they can solve complex mathematical equations. Um, yeah, it's like some of these abilities they have really suggest that they have a different way of processing information. Or there were these twins that were studied by Oliver Sacks who could spit out multi-digit prime numbers that were consecutive, back and forth. And they could do it to a degree when Oliver Sacks was testing them in the 60s that exceeded the capacity of computers at the time. They were validated to 12 digits, but the twins did it all the way up to 20 digits.
Pause, lest anybody think they had memorized those numbers.
They didn't even, the prime tables didn't even go that high.
I love it. Keep going.
And there's no really good algorithm for determining primes, and so they weren't deriving them. And when asked how they received the information, they said they just saw the information. It was just there.
Mm.
And I thought, gee, that's really interesting. That just like these, like there's a famous case of a savant back in the 1800s who was like 5 years old, and all of a sudden he starts spewing out all these mathematical equations and solving them. And they're ones that do calendar calculation. They've never gone to school and learned how to do arithmetic, and yet they could tell you, and any day, any date in the calendar going back, hundreds, sometimes thousands of years, what day of the week it was, and do it almost instantaneously. And I thought, when I heard that, I thought, that it's reliable, it's accepted by science, and yet nobody can explain it. And I was like, I really want to understand what this is. And so I went over to India to study these savants. And while I was over there, just as I was leaving, I was told by one of the parents, and then I was told by a teacher working with the children, that these children can also read minds. And I was like, what?
Ruh-roh.
Uh-oh. And I was like, well, okay, I mean, if you think about it, these savant skills are remarkable in and of themselves. So it's sort of like, okay, they're already, in this category of I don't understand how their brain works. It doesn't work like mine. So they can do something else I can't do. Well, it's worth studying. And so after I came back to the US, I put that out there. I said, well, what if reading minds, the telepathy, and lay lingo, is just another savant skill. And it was at that point I started having people who contacted me from all over the world who report, independently have said, I was sitting down with my child doing, XYZ, and all of a sudden this child knew things that I'm like, how do you know this? I've never told you. And then the child says, well, I can read your mind, types it. I can read your mind. And then they go, well, read my mind now. And then they think something and the child types it and they're like, oh my gosh, what is this? And then they go on the internet and they see that someone with my background has actually been researching this for over a dozen years.
And so at this point, how many people have you tested? How many people have you been in contact with? Like, what's the N?
Well, I've been funding this out of my own on my own dime, out of my private practice, because it's such an outlandish idea for a lot of people. I mean, it's good luck getting funding for this, right? And so I've really been careful about who I would go and study. So I intensively studied three children who could either speak the answers or type independently into a talking device. And so those were the ones that it was worth my going and spending my own money and time to do the studies. And I've presented it at scientific conferences over the last several years. But then Kai Dickens approached me about 4 years ago saying she had heard about my research and that she wanted to do a documentary about it. And so she's accompanied me to film studies with three other children. And that's just a fraction, though, of the children who've contacted me. I'd say that right now I'm aware of at least 60, if not 100, children who have somebody, a teacher, a parent, um,
Yeah.
who's independently been working with them and said, "Oh, what's this?" and then have contacted me.
Okay. So about 100 of people who are contacting you, six who you have really studied in depth with kind of this research methodology lens on. Your the telepathy tapes, the documentary that you guys have made, the podcast that you made, has been number one, very popular. Number two, creating a lot of buzz, a lot of dialogue. People feel very strongly one way or the other. And even in the non-speaking community, people are falling kind of all over the place. And there are some non-speakers who are quite concerned because they're like, well, I don't do this, so now what? What do you have to say kind of in to
Well,
to people who are like, well, it's not everybody, so therefore it couldn't possibly be anybody, I think is really what that means.
Well, yeah, I think yeah, once again, just like we were saying earlier, it's not a uniform, you know, these people are neurodivergent and their brains don't all look the same. And so just because they have those cluster of three different, behaviors, that doesn't mean they all are this,
Mhm.
all operating with the same kind of brain or reality.
Yeah, they're
Uh,
neurodivergent and neurodiverse.
Yeah, they are. Yeah, exactly. They're exactly. So that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is that so the podcast is in the voice of Kai Dickens, who is a filmmaker who saw some of my experiments, and she was just, over the moon, enthusiastic about it. And that comes across in the podcast. But you don't ever hear me in the podcast say, now I've proved telepathy, blah, blah, blah. No, you never hear me say that. Um, what my voice is that. this is happening over and over and over again independently. It needs to get studied. It needs to be studied by somebody who's going to be rigorous and give us some answers. And I guarantee you, whatever answers I come out with, they will be couched in the language that you know exactly what it is that I'm observing and what my best hypothesis is for what it could be, and then what we do next to test that hypothesis. And so I really want to do a lot of experiments that are not just looking at these children saying, "Oh, prove, you know, that you can point to this and that it's what whoever is thinking." I want to also be doing studies in a way where we can eliminate some of these possibilities. Yeah, you know, and but it has to get addressed. I mean, for a long time, the spelling community didn't want to address it because they were afraid that it would delegitimize spelling.
Mhm.
And I very much want spelling to be legitimized. As I said earlier, it's clear to me that they are expressing something. They're expressing something that they want to express. Okay. So that's very much a goal of mine, and it's also a goal of the podcast. But that said, I also think we need to look into, you know, why are so many people over and over again having these experiences? What's going on there? Because they don't know how to educate their child. They don't they really they don't know what to do next because they don't understand what it is that's happening there. And so I just think that it has to be investigated, but investigated in a way that's being very careful about drawing any conclusions, but also respectful to these children and to how sensitive this issue is and how mind-blowing it is to other people as well.
It's so, I have a friend who would say, and I say it with her, this is a both and situation. This is right about the way I hear you tell it, like, let's apply some rigorous science to a very unpopular question, number one. Let's keep in mind that these are people that we are working with and highly sensitive people at that. And let's also keep in mind the families who are really struggling. I mean, none of this is meant to dismiss or say that somehow you know, because you can name X numbers of prime, that somehow your life is marvelous. It's not. It's still really hard. And yet, somewhere in there is this question. And so, again, I appreciate your perspective in terms of holding all of that together, because I think it's not very well done most of the time.
No, it's not. And I don't have any agenda other than being able to find the truth and then use that truth to move forward in a way that's going to be helpful to these families and children.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I think we'll pin it there. I could talk to you for the rest of the day. If people want to learn more about you, where do they go?
They should come to my website, Dr. Diane Hennacy, Hennacy Powell. .com, and I wrote a book 17 years ago called The ESP Enigma, which really is a scientific presentation of really, you know, questioning, you know, why do we say these things are impossible when if we look at modern physics says reality isn't what we think it is. And if they look at the model in neuroscience, the model in neuroscience can't explain anything. It can't explain how the brain would create consciousness. It's such an incomplete model. So we're sort of basically, you know, hamstringing ourselves, you know, over some things that we shouldn't be. And so that's what my book does is it helps people to understand you know why this is such an important area to pursue.
Fantastic. So both of those book is available on the website. You are also still actively engaged in research, and so there is a place to contact you on your website for that purpose as well.
So I've retired from practice and to devote myself to full-time research, and they'll see an email to my assistant, and we are looking for people who want to participate in our studies.
Fantastic. Diane Hennacy Powell, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you.